Hello again, students, and welcome back to more online learning here. We're going to continue on talking about the Cold War, and today we're going to move into looking over the Cold War and how it impacts the Third World. Now, I know, guys, just off the start here, I know some of you have had some challenges. Some people have had problems logging in or working through those challenges and trying to make things work really smoothly. And I know that things have been a little bit challenging with everything from quarantines to coronavirus to earthquakes. So don't worry, we're all in this together. We're going to be successful, okay? But anyways, back to 26.4 in the Cold War. So one of the things that we start to look at once we move past Europe and then we move past Asia. Now, technically, some of the things that we talk about when we're looking at the Third World do take place in Asia, but since Asia is such a hot spot, it gets usually its own independent focus because you have two major wars fought there, of course, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. That's why there's a focus in on there explicitly for itself. Now, when we're talking about the Third World, we're going to talk about quite a few areas, actually. We're not just going to talk about one geographical spot on the map because the Third World is spread out through a lot of different spaces. Typically, when we look at Third World, it's a developed term that comes out of the Cold War. So you have like your first world countries, majorly industrialized, often advanced militarily and technologically. Second world countries are not always commonly mentioned, but they're either semi-developed or developed enough that they're economically viable on their own and do not require mass injection of cash or other things that one of the superpowers would be able to provide in order to make sure that country stays solvent. Now, when we look at the Third World, that's where we start really getting into these different ideas of underdeveloped nations. Now, I know that the term Third World is still used today. It still does exist when we're talking about economic systems. That's usually the common terminology we use for it. In the Cold War, it's kind of similar because you're talking about economically underdeveloped countries that are, how would you say, they are volatile. That's the best way to put it. They're volatile in their government structures and their economic structures. So a vast majority of the people are poor. Usually the richest and most powerful are right up at the top. So if you have power, you have money. And you have this economic disparity. Now that usually leads to revolution. And revolution usually goes one way or another. Either during the Cold War, either you go to the communists or the socialists, and you can get backing by the Soviet Union, or you try to establish a capitalistic system. Now, at the same time, both sides are seeking to control these countries and these spheres of influence. So it creates quite a power dynamic when these people are looking at choosing a side. And they do have to choose carefully because this can result in changes of how market economy works and how much money they can bring in and how well their people might be treated. So there's a lot of factors that go into when these people make the decisions as to what type of government they want and how their economic systems they want to be structured. So again, key points to remember when we're talking about these third world nations, just to reiterate these points. Typically poor, typically industrially undeveloped, economically undeveloped, large amounts of poor people, often ruled by a wealthy elite class. So like prime environment for a Soviet or a communist uprising. It kind of is. And usually when you have those factors, that's when people look at socialist ideas to try to overthrow their governments to bring equality of wealth or opportunity to people. That's why you see socialist movements in South America a lot of times when there's a wealth disparity happening down there. And South America is probably one of the biggest movers and shakers when it comes to governments. They constantly are shifting. They probably are one of the most established sections of what we would consider the third world, where they've been independent a lot longer than a lot of nations, yet they're still dealing with incredible amounts of corruption and greed. So we'll talk about some of those too when we're looking at these things. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what the United States' role is with the third world. And this comes down to when we're talking about the CIA. Remember when we were talking about the CIA a little bit? Well, this is where the CIA plays a large role when we were talking about the Cold War. The CIA, its whole job during this time basically is to either A, spy on the Russians or anybody else that's an adversary, or B, influence foreign governments. And by influence, it can happen by a number of means. After Korea, military intervention is found to be very expensive and very expensive also in cost of lives when it comes to American troops. And so Eisenhower and presidents that follow him both do not want to be stuck in that cycle of continuously deploying the military. So instead, they decide to use the CIA for most of these covert missions where they want to overthrow governments that are not friendly to the United States. This happens quite a bit in South America. And so instead of direct military intervention, the United States decides to go around back doors, and they also prop up and support certain people that they wish to remain in power when there is challenges to their power. So that's going to be critical when we look at this, okay? We will talk about this in a couple of the countries that we are going to discuss too, so that you can kind of get a feel of how the CIA is working during the Cold War. So one other thing that we want to look at before we get too far away is Eisenhower's idea of the domino theory. Now you guys need to understand what the domino theory is, because the domino theory is going to come in play when you're going to write your quick paragraph essay. In fact, it's all based around Eisenhower's speech when he introduces and shows what the domino theory is. So maybe it's really good that you pay attention, maybe take some notes, make sure your essay goes a little bit easier. But basically, the premise behind the domino theory is if that one thing falls, or one country in this case, if one country falls, you have a set of dominoes that would fall with it. And then it goes on and on and on. So if we allow one nation to fall in the hands of communism, it's just going to open the door to more nations taking up on communism too. So therefore, Eisenhower proposed a policy of quick intervention, not necessarily military intervention. Remember, a military intervention is the last case resort that we want to go to. Instead, we're going to rely upon the CIA typically for this type of intervention. So remember the domino theory. This is what we use in foreign policy and how we work with third world governments going forward. It's one of the reasons why we end up in Vietnam and we get stuck there for years in a bloody conflict that doesn't seem like it's going to go anywhere and that we're making no progress in. Again, we kind of learn a lesson in Vietnam that military intervention is not necessarily the best route for us when we should work continuously on clandestine type activities. All right, so let's talk about the Middle East. Middle East, first off, becomes very critical during this time, mainly because it has large oil reserves. Remember when we talked about in World War II, one of the things that Germany consistently lacked was oil. Oil makes the modern economy run. It powers everything from boats, ships, to factories. In fact, out on the east coast of the United States, there's still people who have oil that they use to heat their homes with. So oil is still a very important commodity because you guys use it almost every day when you hop in a car too. So oil is very important during this time and as now too. One thing though with the Middle East is that it is split apart across the board once the colonial powers depart. So when you're talking about the leaving of France and England, they arbitrarily basically have divided up these countries with no understanding of cultural and ethnic groupings, and so therefore they often create countries that have internal conflicts already set in motion because you have opposing forces that do not like each other. And this can be based off of political ideas, it can be based off of religious ideas. One of the biggest religious ideas is when we look at Israel versus the Muslim world and how that plays out between each other. Now, one thing though is that the Soviet Union at this time was starting to put pressure on Turkey and Iran in order to have them come and establish communist governments. Now, the United States, on the other hand, did not want that to happen because both those countries would be straight lines right into the Soviet Union in the event that the Cold War got hot. and also would deprive the Soviet Union of mineral resources such as the oil. And also with Turkey, Turkey restricts some of their access to the ability to move their navy in and out of the Black Sea. So these are critical points that the United States wants to hold on to. Now, there is a start to an uprising within Iran, where Iran is looking potentially like it's going to go to the communists, and the United States intervenes using the CIA and makes sure that the Shah of Iran continues to maintain his power. Now, I know we're talking about the ideas of capitalism versus communism, and those seem to be the dominating powers. The United States does not always look particularly at that when it's looking to protect its interests. So, for example, the Shah of Iran, by no means was he an individual that was going to promote democracy within his country. In fact, he was a pretty brutal dictator across the board. But one thing that he did is that he sold lots of oil to the United States, and he also bought a lot of military weaponry from us. So it was kind of a win-win for the United States to back up this dictator who eventually gets overthrown during the Islamic Revolution. But as you can see, this becomes a continuing trend. The United States will admittedly say, we do not want this to fall in communist hands, but we are willing to back hardline dictators. Now, throughout the rest of the Middle East, you have shifting alliances that are moving back and forth. One of the big problems that we have is with Egypt at the time, which they were moving towards a communist-style government. And this results in direct intervention through, well, not direct military intervention, but again, clandestine intervention from the United States and Israel. Israel does not want them to become communist either, and so does the British, because you have the Suez Canal. That's an important important line today, even to be able to move goods from the Mediterranean and right on through instead of having to go all the way around Africa. So we wanted to maintain control there. So again, we are working behind the scenes with the CIA trying to see if we can overthrow these governments. So again, Middle East is in turmoil, but everybody is trying to seek and procure the oil resources from that region. That's why it's important to study the Middle East and its history during this time frame. And in all reality, it would take us probably at least a good 40-45 minutes if we wanted to discuss all the independent governments that were taking shape during this time frame and what sides they were aligning with and what sides they were going against. You do have a number of countries down there that do decide that they want to try to pursue a democratic process, and then also a number of them that just rely upon heavy-hand dictators, and some that were pursuing and going closer with the Soviet Union. So it's a very complex situation within this region. We have to understand that. Okay, next let's talk about Israel really quickly. Israel is established after World War II, but there was a push and a growth of what was known as Zionism that starts right around World War I and really comes to a head at the end of World War II after the Holocaust. And this is where the British really set aside a plot of land that is historic. It can be used from a number of terminology here. And you're going to hear it a lot of different ways depending on where you go to school and who your professors are. So if you are a more traditionalist and you probably look at more classical history, you might call it Israel because the Israelis had historically inhabited it until basically the fall of the Roman Empire or other regions or other conquests, because there's so many groups of people that come in and conquer and come in and out of there that eventually kind of Israel loses its identity. So now in more modern academia, you're going to hear it referred to as Palestine. This has become a common trend in academia and in modern social movements. So you might hear that we have congressional representatives that refer to Israel now still as Palestine, because to a certain extent there is a historical connotation with it. In fact, Palestine, the word itself, is given by the Romans when they take over the region itself. So how are you going to approach it before it comes into being in the late 1940s? It's going to depend on if you are a true researcher and how you view history. Remember, I always talk to you guys about establishing your worldview. Do your own research, do your own study. I'm not going to tell you one way or another of how to think about it historically. It's not, that is still up to debate, and so therefore I'm not going to tell you specifically where we're at with it until I've done my own personal research on it. And I'd recommend that you do the same. Anyways, during this time, once Israel is created, throughout the entire history of it, between about its very first day of creation when it's invaded by all the Muslim countries around it, up till you have a number of wars like the 6 Days War, you have the Yom Kippur War, and you have other wars that go in and out of Israel that they're constantly fighting against their Islamic Muslim neighbors. And so it's always a flashpoint and a hot point out there. In fact, the United States has strongly backed Israel. Never have they actually intervened in an Israeli war. One thing about Israel to understand is that they look at themselves as being in a constant state of war preparedness because of the dangers that they live in their everyday lives from attack from their neighbors. So they spend 25% of their gross domestic products buying weapons from the United States. Pretty interesting note to look at. All right, so one thing that we look at in order to try to stem and combat the growth of communism is we look at what's known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. Now, the Eisenhower Doctrine, again, goes towards how do we secure the Middle East, and they secure it mainly through money. We'll prop up your governments, we'll stabilize your economies, we'll provide funds to build resources and programs, and we'll put economic investment into your country. So therefore, you can ensure that the Middle East does not fall into communist hands. That's his idea behind this. And so the Eisenhower Doctrine in general does look at spreading that money around in order to make sure that they would be developed countries. Secondly, it is that they would help clandestinely usually, but if it really came down to it militarily, a Middle Eastern country if it was on the verge of falling into communist hands. I'm not sure if a direct military intervention would have probably occurred in the Middle East, but it's up to debate and how that would have gone down. Nowadays, if you understand our history, you will see that we are constantly involved, and since about the 1980s, we've had a substantial role of military activity within the Middle East itself. Again, historical notes if you guys really want to look into it. One thing that we really want to talk about now also is South America. What happens in South America? Remember when I started off telling you guys that they have some of the longest and most stable governments out of the third world. Now, by longest though, not governments, sorry, excuse me, countries. So their governments are constantly shifting. On the other hand, though, their countries have been around for quite a while since their revolutions, usually in about the 19th century. So surprisingly, though, they are still not what we would consider a first or second world country. Again, underdeveloped economically, and so therefore, again, you have that wealth disparity between the two groups of people, which constantly leads to social conflict. And every so often, the military in South America, in whichever country you're looking at, decides at one point that one dictator has gotten out of hand, or that the other ruling government is illegitimate, and they'll overthrow a government on a frequent basis. Or rebels or militiamen would rise up and fight the government and sometimes topple the government too. So South America is a place of volatility throughout the Cold War. One thing the United States really tries to do is we try to lure them with money. And we tell them that if they come to the United States size and that they engage in capitalism, that they will access money from like the international banks that we have access to, the international monetary funds, things that they wouldn't get from the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union cannot promise them access to these types of funds and economic development opportunities. And some of these countries really need that type of investment into their country in order to ensure that they are successful and that they can grow and that they can stabilize their government and economy. If you have a stable economy, typically your government's going to stand. You're not going to have it fall apart on you. One of the people that we do back again, in Chile, you have, I'm going to probably massacre his name, is Pinochet or Pinochet. Tried to have my wife tell me a few times, and I'm still killing that name. But he was, again, there was a movement for communist activity in Chile, and we back him to take over the government there. And again, he's another harsh, brutal dictator. One of the things he's most famous for, my wife agreed with me on this when I remember studying him briefly in my Latin American studies, but he's most famous for taking people that he considered communist agitators, flying them up in helicopters and throwing them out of the helicopters. So if you ever see, I've seen occasionally that people have used that in political cartoons as of late, or even memes, but if you're ever wondering where that comes from, it's from him. He's the one who engages in those activities. There's numerous attempts at revolutions throughout South America, though, during this time frame. And sometimes it's communist-backed and sometimes it's American-backed. In fact, the United States is notorious during this time for using the CIA to overthrow South American governments. We are not shy about it. Typically, we would insert a group there, they would train up a group of rebels, and then that group of rebels would go on and create a revolution to overthrow the government and would install a leader that would be friendly to the United States' objectives. One of the biggest examples of this is when we look at Guatemala and we look at Jacobo Guzman. You're going to read about him a little bit if you guys are doing your research. And one of the things, though, is he takes over the government in Guatemala, and he wants to spread out economic opportunity to his people. Now, one of the issues that he runs into is that the United Fruit Company, which is an American company, owns the vast majority of the best land. In fact, owns most of the land that people would need in order to have a chance at their own economic development. He tries to nationalize and take that land, and in return, the United States sends down the CIA, trains a group of rebels out in actual United Fruit Company land on the other side of the border, and then moves that group into to topple and overthrow his government. So again, as we talk about here, the United States usually is not looking for direct military intervention, but at the same time, they are not shy from using the CIA to work clandestinely behind the scenes in order to overthrow governments. Lastly, let's talk quickly about Cuba. Probably should have spent more time on Cuba, and I'm sorry this video is really long, but it's pretty important for us to talk about some of these elements in the Cold War. Now, Cuba, again, is being backed by the United States and has a pretty oppressive strongman at the helm of its government. Now, there's a lot of U.S. business interests, hotels, tourism. There's a big U.S. interest in Cuba itself. Now, you see the rise up of Fidel Castro during this time, who is looking again, and he spreads the message that he's going to look at fixing economic disparity between the people, and that he believes the only way to do that is to engage in violent revolution. So him and Che Guevara, who you've probably seen before on t-shirts, Che Guevara actually was once he works in Cuba, he moves to South America and attempts to destabilize some countries down there, and that's in fact how he ends up getting killed, is down in South America. Anyways, back to Fidel Castro in Cuba. He was adamant, and he raises up an army, and he manages to overthrow the government. But the one thing again that the United States do not like is that Cuba is, well, Fidel Castro is a communist, and he's looking to set up a communist government less than 90 miles off the coast of the United States. And he manages to do so. And throughout most of the Cold War, you'll find that Cuba is kind of a thorn in the side of the United States. Now, when we look at Fidel Castro, there's a lot of people who talk about the great things that Castro did, where he instituted great educational programs, universal health care, and he sets up a number of programs in order to try to benefit the poor people. At the same time, we need to understand is not only does the United States back dictators, but Fidel Castro in and of himself was a dictator too, and he had thousands of people killed that opposed his government. So if somebody's just trying to sing the praises of Castro, remember he's just like any other dictator where he removes his enemies in the middle of the night. Now, the United States is not overly happy with having this communist government sitting at their shoreline almost. So we again enlist the help of the CIA, and we bring a group of Cuban nationals who are looking to overthrow Castro, and we fund them, and we prepare to lead them down into Cuba to try to take it over. However, the whole plan basically goes awry. And once it goes awry, The CIA backs out at the last minute to provide any necessary support for the people trying to take back their government from Fidel Castro, and they basically end up dead or taken prisoner, and they disappear again. Talking about an individual, of course, when somebody tries to topple your government, you consider him a traitor. You probably would, a lot of people would take the same steps. However, they were backed by American power. So there's the United States' failure to try to take Cuba back from the communists. And again, one of the things that is a problem about this is that Cuba then goes on and engages in all sorts of revolutionary type activity throughout South America during this time frame. And throughout that time, the United States and Cuba basically are fighting each other throughout the continent to try to protect capitalism versus communism based upon Fidel Castro. All right, Africa. One thing I would just say is study on it if you have some free time, because this video is way too long now. But Africa, quick rundown is again arbitrarily split up from the different colonial empires and broken into segments, not necessarily respecting different cultural and ethnic boundaries, and so you often have wars within them. Lastly, one thing to understand about Africa is that since they were conquered by colonial powers, colonial governments only extracted wealth from them. They extracted what they needed, and they did not build infrastructure for the country. So when they pulled out, these countries found themselves in dire need of economic security and also a ability to become industrialized, which does not happen right away. In fact, in a lot of areas, it still has not happened in Africa. And directly based upon colonization and the leaving of Africa has kind of left them in a poor position for years. And both the United States and the Soviet Union during this time really tried that to their advantage to take over some of these regions. Now, just remember, you guys have a test coming up here on Friday. I've actually extended it out so you can take it anytime between Friday and Sunday. So if you've taken that, when you take that test, remember, if you are not ready for it right away, take your time. And secondly, you have a map test. We have not had a lot of time to go over that map. Take the time to do it yourself, study that map up, and then be prepared to take that quiz. All right, guys, thanks you for joining me for this presentation, and we'll see you in our next video.